Lydia Thorpe has made a habit of being a nuisance of herself. She recently heckled, for example, King Charles III as he was in Parliament House. Now, of course, this was not her first excursion into nuisance territory. She was elected as a Green senator before she resigned, again making a nuisance of herself to the Greens. But she was also reportedly rather difficult to work with. She further got in an altercation at a strip club, which is just a little bit embarrassing.
Any black man that stands with a white little like that, you can all get too.
A racist
penis.
dog.
Oh, penis, God. How dare you say that?
Now Lydia Thorpe has erupted at King Charles III during his visit to Australia. Now let's focus on what she said, and there are two overarching claims. First, she's implying that the UK made Australia worse. Second, she wants King Charles III to sign a treaty and supposedly give back people's land. Now the second issue is very easy to address. King Charles III has no such authority. He's a constitutional monarch and is largely symbolic in the UK. Further, that aside, under the Australia Acts, the UK would have no such legislative power anyway. King Charles III simply cannot sign any form of treaty or give back any person's land or do anything of the sort. He simply does not have the power to do so. Now, as to the first issue, let's be blunt. Canberra, Sydney, Melbourne, Parliament House, and all of the other things would not exist but for the British. She currently earns more than $250,000 per year. Lydia Thorpe presumably lives in an apartment that has electricity or running water. She presumably has access to healthcare, much like literally every other Australian. So let's rewind to when the British arrived in Australia. What was there? Well, certainly not running water or electricity or things of that nature. There weren't cities, there were no heavy industry, there was no agriculture of the same type of description as in the UK. There was no real written language either. So therefore, am I supposed to believe that Indigenous Australia would have caught up on thousands of years of technology and science in the space of just a couple of centuries if the UK had not intervened? Or to be blunt, Lydia Thorpe would not have running water or electricity or being seen in Parliament House if it weren't for the UK. Does Lydia Thorpe really think she'd be earning $500,000 per year if not for Parliament House, and if not for the UK? It's simply implausible that she would. So clearly her life is better off than it would otherwise have been. Though one might argue that Australia is imperfect, that when the UK came to Australia, they didn't necessarily act in the most upstanding or in the best way. One might argue that the UK perhaps could have been less brutal, and there have been flaws in Australia's history. However, that is a far cry from saying that Australia was perfect without the UK. It is a far cry from saying that Australia was an idyllic paradise without the UK. After all, the UK brought in its legal system, and for all of its flaws over time, it has things such as the presumption of innocence, and it has a reasonably balanced measure to punishment. That didn't exist before the UK came here. As an example, it's clearly absurd to believe that the UK made everything worse. Now, like I've said, the UK could have done things better when they first came to Australia. That is not in dispute. But Lydia Thorpe now is benefiting from the UK's existence. She's benefiting from Parliament existing. She's benefiting from Victoria existing. She's benefiting from Melbourne existing. And she's benefiting now from Canberra existing. She is basically in the top 1% of the population in terms of earnings, and she is still arguing that the UK has made her life worse. It doesn't actually make any sense to my mind. Senator Jacinta Price has made much the same point. She's argued that while there were some issues with colonialism, and while colonialism was far too brutal, and indeed people were murdered, and they ultimately lost from the colonial era, people who are alive today could have benefited in the form of improved healthcare, running water, electricity, and the like. Here's what Jacinta Price had to say.
In your speech, you claimed some Indigenous organisations, quote, want to demonise colonial settlement. Could I ask you, please, do you believe the history of colonisation continues to have an impact on some Indigenous Australians?
No. I'll be honest with you, no, I don't think so. Positive impact, absolutely. I mean, now we've got running water, we've got readily available food. I mean, everything that my grandfather had when he was growing up, because he first saw whitefellas in his early adolescence, we now have. Otherwise, he would have had to live off the land, provide for his family, and all of those measures, which Aboriginal Australians, many of us, have the same opportunities as all other Australians in this country. And we certainly have probably one of the greatest systems around the world in terms of the democratic structure in comparison to other countries. It is why migrants flock to Australia to call Australia home, because the opportunity that exists for all Australians. But if we keep telling Aboriginal people that they are victims, well, we are effectively removing their agency and then giving them the expectation that someone else is responsible for their lives. That is the worst possible thing you can do to any human being, is tell them that they are a victim without agency. And that's what I refuse to do.
So you don't believe that... As a quick follow-up, you don't believe there's any negative ongoing impacts of colonisation on Indigenous Australians today? Just to confirm.
No, there's no ongoing negative impacts of colonisation.
Now, of course, Lydia Thorpe is entrenched in the Senate, and she is not going anywhere. She is seemingly going to make a nuisance of herself for the remaining term of her Senate stay. She cannot be removed. There's no ability to impeach her for things like this. She might be an embarrassment. She might make the rest of us look a little bit bad. She might be cringeworthy, but that doesn't mean that she can be removed. And she is showing no signs of resigning. It appears she is now free to go and heckle King Charles III, or heckle the Prime Minister, or heckle Parliament per se, or just make a nuisance of herself at strip clubs. She can keep doing this. And she has no signs of actually resigning from the Senate. Now, come next election, it's not necessarily clear she won't even be returned. After all, she's a senator from Victoria. Knowing the nature of Victoria, she might even be able to get re-elected. There might be enough people who would actually vote for someone this ludicrous to go back into Parliament. After all, Victoria voted for Dan Andrews over and over and over again, and then voted for Jacinta Allen. Victoria seems to have a record of voting for some rather dubious characters, and Lydia Thorpe therefore could get back in. Although I'm sure the Greens will give her a bit of a run for her money. Now, she said she's not contesting the next election, but I'll believe it when I see it. Overall, it is a bit of a farce. Now, come next election, we just need to vote against these clowns and hope for the best, because there is really no other way to get around this. Although we are going to be stuck with Lydia Thorpe for a few years, it appears, as depressing as that is.